from a Global South perspective. My name is Fernanda Carvalho, and I am the head of policy for climate and energy at WWF International. And as you know, climate finance is an elephant in the room of climate negotiations. We have many elephants, but maybe we can say this is the elephant in the room. Um, there was a huge discussion in the last COP. The last COP was actually about climate finance, and the biggest delivery expected was a new collective quantitative goal for finance. And we got an agreement of 300 billion. That's far from the needs that climate finance needs to deliver. And many people were dissatisfied with these results. So this is kind of a ghost in this COP. But also in this COP, we have an innovation that is the Baku to Belém roadmap. It's a new, how can I say, it's something new in the process, and it's also very important because people started talking about roadmaps, and we may even see energy forest roadmaps coming out of this COP. So what this roadmap can and should do, it has now become even more important, and this is the objective of this event. This is what we want to explore here. So for that, our panelists are Pedro Rossi, the Vice President, Chief Economist at the Global Fund for a New Economy. We have Iago Montalvão, that is the Executive Coordinator at Transforma, a think tank from Unicamp, Brazil, the University of Campinas. We have David Macaulay, Senior Advisor for Climate and Nature Finance. So please, David. My former colleague, a former Panda, is Myra Javier, Senior Climate Change Specialist of the ADB, the Asia Development Bank. And we have Ali Mohammed, who is not with us yet. He is the climate change envoy for Kenya, and he's also the ambassador of the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force. So to start the event, I would invite Pedro to give us a keynote or to maybe get us started on the conversation on the current state of climate finance and the Baku to Belém roadmap. So over to you, Pedro.
Hi, I will stand up so I can be better after lunch. Uh, well, let me just give you three messages that I think are more general messages around climate finance, which I think is very important, and I hope to bring also a critical perspective on climate finance. So the first message I want to give you, it's we have to discuss development together with climate finance. And development, I mean structural change. You can call it otherwise, you can call it whatever, but we need structural change. We are talking about economic structures that needs to be changed, right? And this is not incompatible with protection of nature. This is not incompatible with protection of biodiversity. It is needed. We need to change the economic structure so we can face climate crisis. We need to change the way we do consumptions, the way we do productions, the way we do international trade, the way we use energy, and this is about structural change. This is about development. And this is also about investments, because investments in the macroeconomic sense has to do with new productive capacities, new infrastructure that will replace the old ones, that needs to be replaced, right? So I think generally the debate on climate finance, it's about where to get the money and not much on how to use it and how to integrate it in a development strategy, right? And from a global south perspective, there is an additional layer. A development strategy has to avoid new forms of dependency. Because you can think about climate finance that could build a new structure that is good for climate, that is good for the country, but you create new dependencies, right? And here, this is important because not always when we go to Global North forums, we look at this perspective. Development countries, when we talk about, when we use about this word development, ideologically, we think they are on the way to somewhere. They are developing to somewhere. But actually, The right word would be underdeveloped country, which is not a way to somewhere. It is a historical conditions given by an international system that is asymmetric, right? So we have to think in a different way. It's not the same path. They have to go through many other things that developed country has not gone, right? And this has to do with exploitation, this has to do with debt, but this has to do also with dependency on new forms of, new flows of imports, new technologies, right? So when we think about a global south country that need to face many challenges, we need to think how he has to also develop its structure so he will not become more dependent on technology. So we have to talk about technology transfers. We have to talk about new ways of sharing knowledge, new ways of sharing technology, so we don't face more asymmetries in the international system. So if we are changing the world economy, we have to face that. It's not just about money, it's also about the structure, the economic structure that comes from the South, right? So this is the first message. The second message, and I come quickly, is someone taking my time? You are. No one. I will be quick. The second message is that we have to demystify the fiscal boundaries on climate discussion and the public money that we have, right? People put a lot of constraint on fiscal policy, on how people don't have money, countries don't have money, there's no money for that, and let's talk about private finances. But fiscal policy is not more than how we choose politically to allocate the resources and where to take and who to give, from the young to the oldest in the public pension thing, from the rich to the poor. This is about policy, right? These are political choices. We have to change the debate on fiscal policy if we want to really face the climate crisis. The real thing here is about mobilization of resources. And real mobilization of resources does not all the way then without public fiscal policy and with real countries' investments, right? Not private. We have to shift the discussion from private to public. Of course, both are important, but I feel the need to talk more about public. There's a lot of talks about carbon market, but you cannot see many sessions about taxation, for example. Taxation is a way to take resources to the public sphere, and we can direct this towards goals, right? When I talked about development is not a natural result of market forces well functioning, well regulated, well incentivized. Development is a political will. If we don't acknowledge that, we don't go anywhere. There's no solution for the market, for the climate crisis, than to change the way we think the economy. That's why in the Global Fund we advocate for a new economy. A new economy that has to do with a new way of organizing society, a new way of doing economic policy, a new way of thinking, economic science, and also about values, because the economy is also about values, right? Are we talking about individualism or are we talking about solidarity? There are two different values that can guide how we can organize. We can organize consciously, debating democratically, or we can organize unconsciously by an invisible hand that supposedly guide the way toward efficiency, but in reality who guide the way is market power.
Okay.
It's corporation and so on.
Please.
And I will finish here with my third point. So the first point is about we have to integrate development with climate finance. The second point is about the real constraints and the imaginary constraints that people talk about fiscal policy, and there are real ones which has to do with external debt, and we have to discuss external debt, especially of developing countries, especially of African countries. And the third thing I want to say and just mention that because my time is almost over, is that the climate crisis is an opportunity to rethink the whole economy, right? We shouldn't miss this opportunity. There's no discussion of climate without integrating a new economic paradigm, right? We have to rethink the way the international organizations are now. We have to rethink the way global south and global north country relates to each other, and we have to face the myth that challenge us to get a real solution towards a transformation, a real transformation that we need. That's why we need to talk about a new economy for people and planet. And I end here, and I thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Wow, right on time, and I think you bring some great ideas and food for thought in terms of, integrating climate finance into a development strategy, not creating new dependency, demystifying fiscal boundaries, shifting the discussion from private to public, which is kind of a different logic of what's going on here, and rethinking the new economy. Wow, we could talk hours about this, but now I want to bring it to the context of those conversations and ask of all panelists, we have 4 of you here, 1 should arrive, but my question is about the Baku to Belém roadmap. As I mentioned, it is an innovation in this process. So how will we recognize this roadmap to 1.3 trillion as a real roadmap in 5 years' time? How can we say it has significantly improved the state of climate finance in terms of scale, quality, and fairness of financial flows? So how do you see this going 5 years from now? I will start with, do we have another mic? Okay, all right. So maybe why don't we go in this order? I start with Ismaira, ladies first.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to the Asian Development Bank. I'm not so sure how to follow the the, the first speaker's intervention, but anyway, from a perspective of multilateral development bank, and I know please don't react that I am from an MDB, but there are a lot of asks in the Baku to Belém in terms of what MDBs can play in terms of all those 5 R's, right? Refinancing, revamping, etc. But I think if we are to measure the success of this Baku to Belém roadmap, it cannot just be measured in the context of numbers or the target. It has to be how climate finance work, or the system of climate finance work, and maybe kind of linked a little bit maybe to the new economy. So you've already mentioned that. I think what we need to look at is scale, for one thing, of course. We will see measurable increases in flows to the low and middle income economies, but as well as higher contributions from the private sector, which is actually one of your points as well. Second is about quality. So finance should be, we all say this, we've all heard this, should be more predictable, concessional, and of course, keeping alignment with the Paris Agreement goals. So at the same time, we equally prioritize adaptation with mitigation in the context of Baku to Belém, 1.3 trillion. There also has to be an element of fairness where vulnerable countries will have easier access, maybe simpler process, as well as lower transaction costs, and of course, transparency and accountability. Lastly, I'll stop here, is about evidence. We have to show, or how to show, the achieved results, right? So from MDB's point of view, we will continue to jointly report on the progress towards our own target, but adaptation should also have grown, well, at least we have to show that adaptation have grown significantly in the next 5 years. And of course, country platforms, where also figured in the Baku to Belém, but as well as what MDBs are doing, should be working like a machine, right? Like functioning effectively, channeling resources to the priorities within the countries. And I think from there we can see the Baku to Bellum, not just a roadmap, but an actual practical guide for action. And I stop there.
Excellent. I think that scale scale flows private sector and finance that's predictable, concessional, Paris Agreement aligned, and also adaptation, which is a key theme, and the demand from civil society is tripling the doubling on adaptation because we know there is an adaptation gap. So excellent points. Over to you, David Macaulay, please.
Thank you, Fernanda. A pleasure being here with you. I'm definitely among friends because I spent almost 10 years both at ADB and at WWF, and now I'm sort of still in the same circles and acting as in an advisory role. I had the privilege of also serving as a reviewer of the first draft of the Circle of Finance Ministers version of the Baku to Belém roadmap. And I got to say, the final version is a huge improvement on it. They did listen to civil society and to various other stakeholders who gave feedback along the way. I won't go into the role of the multilateral development banks because I think Esmira has covered that quite well in terms of the way but there is a very strong emphasis, and building on the work of the G20, there's a very strong emphasis on increasing the function and relevance and role and ease of access and listening power, if you will, of the multilateral development banks in this field, which is, I think, all quite positive. But the main takeaway that I got from following this process of the development of the roadmap through the Circle and now into the format of the two COP presidencies version of the report is that it helped to bring the finance ministries and finance ministry perspectives to the table in ways that started with COP26 and in Glasgow. I mean, that was the first aspiration, but it was somewhat naive, I think, in Glasgow, that you could, you just sort of Mark Carney, bring Mark Carney in, and you have the central banks with the network for greening of financial system and so forth, and somehow it would organically work. But really, they're speaking such different languages than the negotiations and the language of the Paris Agreement and the language of those who are the ones who brought us here together in Belém, the negotiators around climate finance. But I think that the work of this roadmap, in answer to your question, 5 years from now, will be measured in terms of how successful they were really in bringing that perspective and the activity of finance ministries around the world to the table, particularly in emerging markets and developing countries. So we'll see where that leads, but I think it's quite promising because it's, as you were saying in the outset, it's really not so much about climate finance per se, but about capital and where do you derive the capital that's necessary to bring along the developing countries at their various stages of development. And the sort of middle income and emerging markets are quite different than LDCs and SIDS, and they have very different needs. And I think that is acknowledged to a certain extent, but could be stronger in the roadmap, this differentiated roles and capacities, lack of capital markets in the poorest countries, the importance of grant resources and international flows is so much greater in the poorest countries than it is in the middle income countries. And even the debate over mitigation and adaptation, it's disappointing lately the way that some countries, which will go unnamed, are, and even some key influencers in the finance sector are sort of pushing for greater attention to climate adaptation at the expense of mitigation in very different, not helpful ways. Yes, it is true that the middle income countries now can rely on basic market finance and economic forces to drive investment into wind and solar and batteries because they just make good market sense. And even the role of organizations like ADB in some of the rapidly advancing Asian and Pacific, well, less Pacific, but Asian countries, the role of ADB is less on providing finance and more on facilitating policy through policy-based lending and others to get the force to channel those market forces. And then, but the important thing is on the adaptation debate is that should free up resources that can be redirected, whether it's from the private finance or most importantly from the public north-south flows into climate change adaptation. So we'll have to see whether those perspectives from finance sector generally and from finance ministries and public policy and regulation are carried over. And I'm relatively optimistic that the Circle of Finance Ministers has now agreed to work with the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and to hopefully have a seat at the table in the negotiations through their country representatives to bring this perspective. So let's see.
It's great to hear, that there was improvement in this roadmap from the first versions and you could recognize the input of civil society and etc. That gives me comfort. I think bringing the finance ministry's perspective and which role they can have in the process, it's very, very important. When you speak about different languages, and the discussion of taxonomies has been growing. This is super important. Capital, and there's no such thing as adaptation versus mitigation. I'll just end it like that. The less you invest in one, you honorate the other. That just doesn't exist. We need to tackle climate change, and that's it. But anyway, I want to hear the perspective of Iago on this.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Fernanda and Tatiana. I will bring here a point of view from the academia, and I really agree that the Habacuc to Belém roadmap, it's a really important tool to us because this document brings a lot of important questions about how to use and how are the instrument and which are the instruments to use the climate finance, because only scale up is not sufficient, but how you use. But I would like to bring here additional points, and let's begin underscoring a central point to me. Public finance and public investment must be at the center of the climate transition. The state cannot be only a mere vehicle to de-risking the private capital. Many green sectors, especially those that are in early stages of technological or industrial maturity, simply cannot generate the returns that are required to attract the private investors at a scale, okay? And this is even more evident in the case of the adaptation, where social value is high, but private profitability is, in the most part of the time, it's low. For this reason, I think that public actors must lead by planning, directing, coordinating the investment, by building productive and technological capabilities, and expanding the infrastructure needed for the decarbonization and the climate resilience. This leadership must be grounded in the fiscal space like Pedro was talking about here, and most all, political space of decision, of will, both of which are essential for countries, especially in the global south, to pursue their own development and the strategies without harmful conditionalities that it's a lot of time imposed to these countries. The pandemic, some years ago, demonstrated that when political will exists, the mobilization of extraordinary resources is entirely possible. Trillions were deployed because the crisis was visible, the death was immediate, so the people was reacting at the time. The climate crisis is no less urgent, but we cannot wait for the impact to become more and more catastrophic. We have to react building a new economy. So in this way, I really agree with Pedro. From a technical standpoint, we already have the instruments that could be scaled, like special drawing rights, expanded a concessional window in multilateral development banks, debit for climate swaps, internationally coordinated mechanisms to tax fossil fuels, to tax the income of the richer people. These tools can provide liquidity, reduce debt burdens, create fiscal room necessary for the long-term climate investment without deepening the fiscal vulnerability of the global south countries. This is, I think, is a key issue. But finance alone, and I am just, and I will finish here. Finance alone is not enough. We know that. Because the countries, especially the poorer ones, need the capability, the institutional and technical capacity to transform these fundings into real outcomes, into resilient infrastructure, into renewable energy systems, into climate-adapted agriculture and green industrialization above all. I think this is a really important matter to the global South countries. Supporting project preparation, public sector capabilities, long-term planning, all of this is important as mobilizing the capital itself. Ultimately, the agenda requires structural reform of the international financial architecture. I think it's a really good point in the Baku to Belém roadmap. It is a really good point in the discussions in the G20. Because we need first greater representation of the global south in the decision making, in our international institutions, financial multilateral institutions. We need new regional and south-led institutions. I think this is important. Institutions like the New Development Bank must be strengthened. We need to debate about the monetary hierarchies and this international finance system that shape the global liquidity and exposure to shocks that the global south countries are at the most part of the time being exposed. Without these changes in this system, in this logic of the system, in the logic of the currency hierarchy, in the multilateral institutions, we will remain misaligned with the goals of the climate justice and the sustainable development. Well, to finish, in sum, the climate transition will not happen at the needed speed or scale without a proactive participation of a developmental state in the global south countries. Adequate fiscal and political space and a global financial system redesigned for resilience, equity, and planetary survival. I think could be a lot of structural things, measures, not specific or technical things, but we need to address these questions. We need to push up these questions even more, because if we let this besides, we will not go to the center of the question. So I try to bring here some of these more structural debates. Thank you.
Which is amazing, by the way. I mean, public finance being at the center, the relevance of fiscal policies, and also political choices, the fact that some instruments already exist, but we need to make use of new ones, and the point that I really want to highlight is, for example, in the climate debate, we love acronyms, right? And we talk of MOI, means of implementation. And whenever we think of means of implementation, we tend to think instantly of finance. But there are other components. Capacity building is one of them, and it's what you mentioned. It's super important. Technology sharing, so it's not only about finance, is another key point. And changing the logics of the system to consider development. Wow. So do you want to talk about the Baku to Belém to us, Pedro, your perspective? So we close this round and try to have another round.
So I gave a very critical and general talk at the beginning, but I do agree with a lot that has been said here. around the roadmap. And I think there are some advances, but we need to push for more, right? And I don't see it as a problem of perspective, theoretical perspective, or acknowledging the problem. I do see that as a problem of mobilizing people, right? And mobilizing towards the right things. I see that there is not much mobilization in the discussion of the role of the state, of public finance, of a new economy, as there is in climate. We have, I mean, 20 years ago, people didn't have the consciousness about climate that people have today. And I think today, people don't have the consciousness about what the role of the state is, how democratic it can be the state, how public resources can be used. And people may have this consciousness, and we have to build that and integrate that to the climate discussion. So it's about allocating resources that can be public and really directing private resources. When I talked about investment, and the public investment discussion is in the roadmap, but I think we should push that more strongly. We are talking about each society, each nation having the ownership of its destiny, right? Who drives investment, drives transformation? And who is driving investment? This is the question. Is it markets? Where are we going? Is this like abstract consciousness that at the end is driven by capital, but corporate power? Or is it a democratic consciousness that can drive the resource forward? So this is the big question. Who drives our destiny?
I hope it's the democratic consciousness. I truly do. But anyway, I mean, I think that the debate is fascinating and I'm learning a lot. But now I would like to ask some specific questions to panelists, and I will kind of move in this direction now. So the first question is to you, Iago. How can climate finance serve as a tool to combat inequality? Such a big problem in this country. If you just walk around the COP, you see it. So either through better allocation of resources reaching the national level, or through alternative instruments that bypass the distortions of capital costs and exchange rates. So that's the question for you.
Okay, thank you again. I will bring again the theme of the public investment, not only the public finance. I think it's important to distinguish the both of these concepts, because when you have a public finance, you can only finance the private sector, as we are seeing in a lot of experience, and in Brazil also, when you use tools with fiscal resources to de-risk the investments of the private sector. That is an important thing, because we are talking about new sectors. We are talking about sectors that needs the help from the public sector to improve, to begin the investments. But when you talk about regionalities, when you talk about social social needs, the state is the better tool that we have to address these questions. This is because it's not moved by this accumulation of this profit logical. And in the sectors that need more social support, like support to regional communities, support to adaptation in cities and in agricultural, to small families that are in the agricultural, the private projects and the private capital does not lead the transformation that we need. So we have to, I bring again this concept, we need to build state capacities. I think we need to look to the experience of China, because it's an experience that are showing to us that when the state have the capacities, when the state have the tools, and when the state can have the autonomy to pursue his own destiny, like Pedro said, you can build a lot of really impressive things and projects because you are addressing not in the way that you can value your capital, but in the ways that you can value your social returns. I think this is a really important question to us, and I will finish here talking about an important thing that that I saw in the Baku to Belém roadmap, and it is an important discussion here in the negotiations about the rating agencies. I think we need to change structurally and change profoundly this logic of the rating agencies, because this is one of the most important things that are prohibiting, that are difficult, creating difficulties to the global south countries to access the capital. And not only the governments, but also the companies of the global south. So if we don't build new rating agencies with the participation of the global south, or if we don't change the metrics, the ways that these agencies are evaluating the cost of capital, it will be really hard to the global south countries to access capital and even to development your own financial systems, your own companies. This is a part of the change of paradigm that I totally agree with Pedro that we need. Thank you.
Thank you so much for once again highlighting the very important theme of state capacities, also bringing in rating agencies into the conversation. But now to David, I would like to hear a little bit more about MDBs. So despite their relatively modest volumes, MDBs are widely recognized as concessional and catalytic mechanisms. So how can they be even more effective, either by increasing amounts of available resources, but also how do they address this criticism of reducing the gaps between what's pledged and what is really disbursed, approved, etc. So if you could share your thoughts on this.
Well, first I feel like that's Esmaira's job, but maybe I can speak a little more.
Is it on?
I was joking. I should let Esmaira answer that, but maybe I can speak slightly more freely since I'm no longer with MDB. But I am still working with several and working with climate investment funds, with the Global Environment Facility, Green Climate Fund, who all are partnering with the MDBs and trying to be more innovative about those kinds of partnerships. They are trying. Things are just, even since I left Asian Development Bank, things have changed enormously. When I was heading climate programs, for example, just the quantum side, we were happy to set and achieve a target of $3 billion per year. And now ADB, if I've got this right, is over an 11-year period trying to achieve $100 billion in its climate financing. So there's the quantum aspect, and that comes from that relates to all the debate over the last several years on the new collective quantified goal as well, and their contribution there. The second is, how do they use those still relatively scarce public resources, as you mentioned, Fernanda, in the most sort of catalytic way to mobilize. And of course, the heaviest emphasis thus far has been on mobilizing private capital, but I think increasingly they're looking to work more through country-driven mechanisms like the country platforms, whatever you call them. I mean, they're different by definition, it's a country platform and country defined. I mean, Brazil is very proud of its investment plan, and that's one example. And they actually draw on that in the roadmap as an example. But there are many other varieties of that. Some of them even at the regional level, like the Pacific Island countries. You know, they come together at the regional level because they don't have individual capital markets. So they're trying to pool their resources for attracting capital. They're also trying to pool their risks for catastrophic typhoon damages or, you know, slow onset impacts of sea level rise, whatever it might be. So the MDBs are increasingly, and through the climate funds, they have their own pavilion here, and this is the third year they've done that. And they are trying to, they had an action plan that they sort of agreed to. They kept it in draft. Now they're trying to do more of a annual report. MDBs have had 3 years of annual reports, 4 years of annual collective reports on their climate. I'll let you answer. Well, but the new format, I think, is really much broader in terms of common metrics and indicators and so forth. Well, you can correct me on that. So they are trying to work collectively. Those MDBs that are global in nature, World Bank, IFC, Islamic Development Bank, not exactly global, but you know, have broader reach. They're trying to play roles and work with the regional development banks in a more collaborative fashion in terms of where they're working. So we'll see. I think some of those same issues, you know, on the quantum, on access, on simplifying access, whether it's through the multilateral climate funds or through the MDBs themselves, trying to follow the principles of country-drivenness, trying to broaden the sources of finance. Huge issue on contributing versus beneficiary countries during NCQG debate. It continues now. You can look at it, say, with TFFF, with this tropical forest fund. You have Indonesia and Brazil as contributors. Apparently China's holding back because it's concerned about the rules of the game there. So we'll have to see where that leads. But it's just, these issues haven't disappeared, but I think they're now being debated in a much more open fashion. They're being debated in a context of not just north-south flows, but the broader access to capital, as well as the equity considerations and the justice aspects are coming more to the fore, whether it's for highly indebted countries and new ways of dealing with that. IMF and MIGA are now more at the table within the architecture. So whether it's at the global level and reforming the architecture, which I agree is absolutely needed, or at the country level through country platforms and being more driven that way and dealing with a wider range of topics, I think that it's all moving in a positive direction. And I think a 5-year time frame is a realistic one for sort of assessing, maybe tied to the stock take and tied to some kind of a 2030 milestone on the way to the 2035 1.3 trillion and 300 billion goals. Hopefully we don't have to wait till 2035 to achieve those targets.
Okay. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me on this one? Okay. So yeah, great points working. It's good to know that MDBs are working collectively, and also country platforms and country drivenness are words that resonate very much with me. I think it's important. Yeah, and now to you, Smyra, the tough question. Are MDBs on track with their commitment to scale up their annual climate finance for low and middle income countries to $120 billion by 2030, including 42B for adaptation? What is the Asian Development Bank perspective? So, real life.
Okay, I can say yes. Maybe I could stop there. That was the question, right? We're on track. But just to add to David's part is that we always look at MDBs as a financing mechanism, right? It's about finance, but what countries or other institutions always forget is that we also deliver a lot of technical assistance and capacity building. So, and then more currently, we are looking at policy-based lending as a critical tool to create enabling environments in our country clients, right? So that's policy, that's technical assistance, it's capacity building. So financing shouldn't just always be that key role. But of course, I understand that would be the case, right, for being a bank. Now, just before I start on some numbers, is that um, the amount MDBs have made strong commitments, but the actual delivery of the amount of financing, the scale of amount of financing that is needed, will actually be limited to the capital adequacy that we have, right? The risk sharing mechanisms that are available, and how private sector can actually leverage or contribute to much of what we are doing right now. So MDBs have collectively committed in 2019, to reach 65 billion in climate finance by 2025, and 18 billion of that going to adaptation. So in that context, we have actually surpassed that already in 2024. And this 120 billion plus 42 billion for adaptation, 65 billion from private sector mobilization was only announced last year. So if we look at that context, then I would like to be very positive that we are on track to reach that 2030 target. Now, in the context of ADB, we, and David, thank you for already saying the 100 billion commitment that we made. In addition to that, we have committed that more than at least 50% of our portfolio will definitely go to climate change or addressing climate change solutions. So far, out of the 100 billion from 2019 to 2024, we have already reached 41.9 billion. So we're halfway there, halfway through the 10 years. But of course, with our own capacity, capital adequacy framework that unlocks an additional 10 billion, we are quite confident that we will actually be reaching that. And more significantly, adaptation from our perspective has been increasing every year. So more than double digit numbers have been increasing. So we are very, very confident that we will reach that by 2030.
Okay, wow. This thank you for the positive tone. I think good news are also welcome in this space, you know. So it's refreshing to hear that, you know, adaptation finance is increasing, that the commitments from 2019 have been even reached and surpassed. That's really, really good. That brings a lot of the much needed hope in this process, and also policy-based lending as a new practice is also very interesting. I wonder if we have any questions from the audience, because we have time maybe for 2 questions before we finish. No. Well, let's wait. Oh, okay. There is one by Tatiana from WWF, who works with us on this very, very complicated subject of economics, because, you know, I am a policy person. Your universe fascinates me, and I'm trying to understand more and more every day, because I understand how it's needed, you know. But over to Tati, who helps me on that.
Thank you, Fernanda. And yeah, I was speaking in English. Thank you, Fernanda. The question is, lack of trust is a thing when discussing climate finance, right? So right now, inside rooms, countries are saying NDCs and taxonomy are becoming conditionalities to access finance. 9.1 is beginning to be interpreted as, you know, unwelcomed intervention in national budgets, mainly of the global north. 9.1 as well as top-down, as a top-down commitment of the Paris Agreement, not wanted, a not wanted top-down commitment. UTMs as intervention in national trade and economic policies. And some countries are now joking inside rooms that maybe the whole conversation taking place here is leading us for some kind of climate shock therapy, as for instance, Daniela Gabor, the amazing economist, is writing about, and not the climate love therapy that they would like to see going on in the room. So the question is, are we heading to climate shock therapy or climate love therapy in relation to leveraging domestic finance, country platforms, and stuff like that, since those mechanisms, they are also under great pressure from global south countries that are saying that this is just a transfer of responsibility from the north to the global south. And how do you see it?
Okay, so we don't have much time. So I want to first thank the panelists. This has been an amazing conversation, but I will frame this question as shock or love therapy. And then you can give your final remarks because we would need to leave. So over to you.
I don't want to start.
Start from that.
Shock or love? I think I love Daniela, by the way. She's my friend, and she's a great critical economist. And by this, I think she's provoking. She's a provocative person. She's provoking us to think if, I mean, what is being discussed here are the right things and are the things that we will move forward. I should agree with her, right? So it's more love than shock, and more shock than love that is being discussed, and we need to change this. But I would say, and dialoguing with the previous question, that there are some interesting initiatives here and there. In Brazil, for example, I say two things and I stop there. In Brazil, the economic transformation plan is being made by the Ministry of Finance. And this is not irrelevant. This is very, very relevant because in many countries, there is a ministry that deals with climate and nature, and the Ministry of Finance doesn't worry about it, right? So just dealing with fiscal things, interest rate, and so if we don't mix this up, we don't go anywhere. And I think Brazil, it's an example of that. I mean, it's cross ministries. Everyone is worried about climate. The second example, I would say that is a positive thing, are some of the instruments Brazil is discussing. I don't think TFFF is a good one. The climate fund, it's more interesting one, and has to do with a national development bank that is BNDES, that has the capacity to drive the resources much better, and is mobilizing resources through treasury bond. So those are interesting ways to think forward and to have a more equilibrate and to resonate with the provocation of Daniela Gabor.
Okay. No, I will just use another citation from Daniela Gabor that she said, and another economist that was in Sevilla in the Finance for Development Congress, that they said we are trying to achieve the billions to trillions, but in reality we are achieving the billions to millions, because we are the public banks and the development banks are really, really important, but to where these resources are going are more important ever, and I will just say that. Thank you.
So I think the shock is inevitable, and it comes from the rising impacts of climate change. And so that can be turned into something of a call to action, and I hope that that's the case. It gives a common purpose. And the love part, as you said at the outset, it's about development in the end. And so to the extent that the MDBs and the others can help countries develop their fiscal resources, develop their domestic resources, which are by definition going to be very driven by their own national interests, then that can help from a ownership standpoint, and I guess that qualifies as love.
Okay, before I impart what's from my end, if it's love or shock, but I think in the shock part, I think there is a need for system for green taxonomies, among other things, right? We need to have this within the countries because I'm working in several countries developing that, is to make sure that there's no greenwashing, that what you're actually investing will actually produce an outcome, a positive outcome. So whether love or shock, I think it's both. We need it to actually achieve the results that we want to get to.
Sorry, Fernando, one last thing, sorry. Since we're in the Panda Hub, the other shock is the exceeding planetary boundaries and nature. And I think it's great that we're here in this region to talk about the links between climate and nature, because that will also give a common purpose going forward.
Thank you. I'd like to have this conversation going on for many, many hours, but now we need to leave. Thank you so much.